Morning. Welcome to the worship service. Parish Church of Cross. Good to see each of you here this morning. Good to hear little voices in the audience. Remember the President's Day meal tomorrow. I don't believe the sign-up sheet is on the table anymore, but if you haven't signed up and you'd like to come, let Nate or Rachel know. 12 o'clock. Even if you have to work, if you have an hour for lunch and you're able to make it, then maybe you come enjoy the meal. I even wore my Constitution tie there, in case you haven't noticed. For the lesson this morning, I'm going to have some help from some of the Christians here this morning. And they get a little treat. You know, we have budgets, all of us do. In our family, whether we have a budget written down or not, we have a budget because some bills have to be paid. Whether we know now what our bills are going to be in August, we know those bills are going to be paid. And everybody has to have a budget, whether we stick to it or not. And so, somebody has got the budget who's for the house payment. You know, We've got to pay for the house because we've got to have some place to live. So, who has the house payment? Raise your hand. This house payment here. All right. Dolores has got the house payment, and there's Joe Browning. What's next on our list? We have entertainment. Now, you got to go out and have a good time when you work 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week or more. Sometimes you don't have any other option than to stop off and eat somewhere, or you want to go out bowling or see a movie or something. So you got to have entertainment. That's relaxing time, right? Everybody's got to have time to relax. So we got to make sure we do that. Well, let's see, what else is next? Oh, the water bill. Where would you be without water? So we got to pay our water bill. Who's got the water bill? Who's got the water bill? All right, I see a hand up over there. I'll pay your water bill. What else we got here? Food. You might want to buy into that at the top of the list. So Eric over there's got the food. Is that a coincidence or what? Alright, so Eric likes it. Do you like brownies? Oh, there you go. Not supposed to have it. There's our food. We've got to pay for the food, but we've got to eat. Alright, what comes next? Clothes. Got clothes. Got to buy clothes, especially if you've got kids. Especially if you've got little kids, right? Adam and Jennifer, because they run through clothes. They only wear them for a short period of time and grow out of them, so we got to buy clothes. Got to have clothes for the summer, clothes for the winter. You ladies got to have clothes, you got to have shoes, and that's your umbrellas and so forth. So, let's see. Electricity. Got to pay for the electricity. Who's got electricity? All right, we're right there back. Electricity. Because you got to have the refrigerator going, you got to have the TV going, got to have the air conditioner going, and the heat right now. So we got to make sure we got to pay the electricity bill. Kentucky Utility almost lets you have electricity based on your looks, so you got to pay for the electricity. What's next? Car payment. Got to buy a car because you can't get to work without a car, so we got to have a car payment. Got to pay for the car. Here we go. Got to pay for the car, especially if you've got teenagers coming up. Got to pay for the car. We've got our car payment taken care of. You may not have thought of this. We also have to pay for the garbage, right? You got garbage picked up? Everybody's got garbage pickups, and you gotta pay for the garbage man. Because he's got to take all this garbage that we bought to the dump. Who got the garbage? Who has the garbage bin? Who's got the garbage? Yeah. Oh, okay. Joe over there. Joe, do you like brownies? Okay. Well, you can share it with Grace there. All right, we'll have a couple more. After their garbage. Uh-oh. Credit cards. Anybody got credit cards? Gotta pay a credit card bill. Gotta pay the credit card bill. So who's got a credit card? Right there. Alan takes care of the credit cards. Now we got a credit card paid for. All right, what's left? What's left on our budget? Oh, God's got to get something. God's got to get something here. Who's got God? Who's got God? Russ over there. Russ, do you like crumbs? Here's God's share right here. There's God's share right there. Maybe God doesn't like brownies anyway because all he got was crumbs. Turn to Malachi chapter 3. Malachi chapter 3. Is that how we treat God? When we look at our budget, is that where God is in our budget? Is God down there at the bottom where he gets the crumbs? The book of Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. It's page 802 of the Pew Bible. If you're using that, it's right before the Gospel of Matthew. Malachi chapter 3. Malachi lived about 400 years before Jesus. And if you want to know some of the historical background of Malachi, you go back and read Ezra and Nehemiah. The Jews during Malachi's day, they had been, if you remember, they had spent 70 years in captivity in the nation of Babylon. But they had come back. And by the time Malachi comes along, they've been back in their own home country for about 100 years. They came back really excited. Kind of like when you're first baptized. You're really excited. You want to give God everything. You want to go out and evangelize the world. You start talking to your family and friends. You're on fire. And that's the way the Jews were when they came back from exile in Babylon. But after a period of time, the fires just kind of dwindled down. Life becomes mundane. Day in and day out doing the same thing. And your spiritual fervor kind of grows cold. And that's the way it was with the Jews here during Malachi's day. And when that happened then, God kind of gets put on the back burner. When we see in Malachi chapter 3 that the Jews had gotten where they started giving God the leftovers. I want us to look at Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 12, and notice what God says here to his people, because this message is just as true for me and you today as it was when Malachi wrote it. Notice in verse 8 the sin that the Israelites were guilty of. God says, "Will a man rob God?" That's one of the 10 Commandments, isn't it? Thou shalt not steal. We wouldn't think of stealing from our fellow man. But God says, "Will a man rob God?" Yet you are robbing me. And the Israelites backed up and they said, "Well, how are we robbing you, God? How am I stealing from God?" And God says, "You're doing it in tithes and in offerings." In the book of Malachi, God accuses the Jews of an attitude, a wrong attitude, a sinful attitude, and then they respond back to him. And this is the 7th time in this book so far that God says you are engaging in this behavior, and the Jews respond and say, How do we time they do that back in chapter 1 and verse 2. In chapter 1 and verse 2, God tells the Jews, I loved you. But you say, how have you loved us? The reason why the Jews are robbing God in chapter 3 verse 8 is because they are questioning God's love for them in chapter 1 verse 2. When we don't give to God as we should, it's because we're questioning God's love for us. It's because we're doubting that God is going to take care of us. And so the Jews say, how are we robbing you, God? And God says, well, you're doing it your tithes and your offerings. Now think about that just a moment. God requires His people to give. And that requirement to give is so powerful that when His people don't give, it's as if they're taking from God. You see that? God says, you are robbing me. Well, they weren't taking anything from God, but the point was they weren't giving to God like they should have been in their tithes and their offerings. We probably all know what the word tithe means. It comes from the Hebrew word that means a tenth. The tithe was a tenth. The tithe is used, the word is used 21 times in the Old Testament. 17 chapters in the Old Testament discuss the tithe. The most prominent one probably is this passage from Leviticus chapter 27, where God says every time of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, that is 1/10, is the Lord's. It's holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. Every tithe of the herds, every tenth of the flocks, every tenth of the animal that passes under the herdsman's staff belongs to God. That's what God required of the Jews in the Old Testament times. Now the word tithe or tenth is only mentioned maybe a half a dozen times in the New Testament. Really concentrated in two passages. Matthew chapter 23 and Mark's account, Luke's account, where Jesus criticizes the Pharisees because they would tithe their garden herbs. Here's 1/10 of the dill and 1/10 of the mint and 1/10 of the cumin. But then Jesus accused the Pharisees of overlooking more important matters like justice and mercy and faithfulness. Now, Jesus says you should have done this and not left the other undone. So they should have been tithing the garden herbs, but they should have also been practicing justice and mercy and faithfulness. And then the other passage that talks about the tithe in the New Testament is in Hebrews chapter 7, where the Hebrew writer talks about the fact that Abraham paid a tithe to Melchizedek, and that story is recorded in Genesis chapter 14. That's the first time we have recorded of anybody giving a tithe in the Old Testament. Now what we observe there then is that God does not require Christians to give a tithe. The New Testament doesn't require Christians to give a tithe. But the principles of giving that we see here in Malachi chapter 3 are eternal principles, universal principles, and they are applicable to us today. Are we robbing God of what we ought to be giving? The first fruits. So that's the sin. The people were robbing God. The Jews were robbing God. And God tells them in verse 9, here is your punishment for robbing me. Verse 9, God says, you are cursed with a curse. Notice how emphatic that is. You are cursed with a curse. God is emphasizing the punishment that was coming on them, or that was they were feeling right then. For you are robbing me. And he says there in verse 9, it's not just one or two of you either. It is the whole nation. The whole nation of the Jews were robbing God. There wasn't a whole lot of them that were